Welcome back. Today I want to talk about a brand new box set I just received, and that is Dorothy Ashby's With Strings Attached. Apologize for the glare. I wanted to show you what it looked like with hype sticker on and everything before I actually unpackaged it. Then I'm going to listen to it and then I'm going to sort of give you my thoughts. But very excited about this release. So this is by the UK label Newland. I've previously talked about at least their Charles Mingus release, but they've had a few other releases as well. One by Blue Mitchell, another by Jerry Mulligan, and it feels like their calendar in terms of release, or the release schedule, is really picking up, and I'm really excited because so far they've done just an outstanding job on their prior releases. So what you get with this, before we get into like that much detail, I want to kind of to give you some highlights and then we'll jump in. So there are 6 studio albums represented here, and these include really the first 6 albums that she ever had as a leader. And so this is from 1957 to 1965. Interestingly, each of these 6 are kind of on a different label. I say kind of, well here, let me tell you why. So the first one is on Regent. The next one is on Prestige. Number 3 is on technically New Jazz, which, okay, it's a Prestige label, but like, let's, hang with me here in terms of them each being different. You have number 4 is on, let's see, Jazzland, which is a Riverside subsidiary. The 5th one is on Argo, and the 6th one is on Atlantic. So very interesting that even across just a short period of time, that each of her albums would sort of be on like a different label. But I'm pretty excited about this thing, both because I love her music, and I think everybody knows that. I've actually already created a video on, I think, her first 5 albums, because I own original pressings, and I created a video like 7 months ago. I'll put a link in the description in case you want to check that out. But what that video gets into is a little bit of the history of the albums, as well as Dorothy Ashby, and how she was a little bit of sort of the first of her craft, if you will. And so in terms of the innovation that she brought music, as far as improvising with the harp, really setting the stage, I think, for Alice Coltrane and many others. Brandee Younger, who's a more recent sort of contemporary harpist. But anyway, very, very instrumental musician, pun intended. So with this, what you get is those albums. So 6 studio albums. They're all 180 gram. Out of the 6, 4 of them are cut from the original analog tapes. The reason why 2 of them aren't is because the tapes are lost. And those 2 are the very first title on Regent, and then her self-titled that happens to be on, is it Argo? Yeah, it's Argo/Cadet, right? Kind of like the same label. So unfortunate that those 2, we don't have the original tapes, but what can you do? All 6 of these, however, the lacquers were cut by Kevin Gray. It's just that 4 of them are that all analog pressing. So these are manufactured at Palace. Again, I mentioned on 180 gram vinyl. It says reverse board deluxe sleeves. Can't wait to open this up and check it out. And the last thing that I'll say before we sort of open it up and get into it and see how it looks is that this is a pressing of only 1,000 copies. And, don't get me wrong, Dorothy Ashby, I don't know what kind of following she has these days. Certainly that video that I made was one of my least watched videos that I've ever made. Probably between that and the Chris Connor video, I'm trying to think. I don't really think too much about that type of stuff, but I am aware that was that was not watched as much. I will say, though, that this box set has already been written up in the New Yorker, as well as a number of other publications. And the fact that we have Brandee Younger, who I believe participates with some of either the liner notes or like a booklet or something like that, we'll know when we dive into it. I think that's bringing a little bit more of a present day audience and placed on her music, because Brandee is doing such a sort of an amazing job, both as just being an innovative musician who's playing music today, but also I think revitalizing the instrument and adding a lot of interest to it, because she's doing such a phenomenal job. So anyway, there's some connectivity there, and maybe I'll try to talk about that in a little bit. But yeah, let's kind of dive into some of those details. All right, so first, just a little bit on the packaging now that the shrink wrap is off. What you'll see here, first of all, is just a really lovely image. We've got this sort of silver foil around the outside, which looks really nice. Really sort of classic, kind of signature almost of Dorothy Ashby on the spine, which will look really nice, I'm sure, on the shelves for those who like to look at their records. Well, everybody, all us collectors like to look at our records on the shelves. On the back, it's it's kind of interesting. This is maybe slightly unusual in that they decided to show you high quality images and even track lists, as well as the album names for each of the 6 that are included. And I kind of think that this is nice. It's maybe not traditional. Maybe normally you'd expect to see continuation of liner notes or some, even maybe just blank image, right? You're not blank image, but you know, just all black or something like that. But here they decided to picture each of them. And again, I think that because Dorothy Ashby is maybe not quite as known, it's helpful to kind of be able to see on the back what you have, what's inside, right? Remind yourself, I suppose, of what those albums are. And so, and this is the first time I'm opening this, is just for you. So let's see what this, this is actually really pretty heavy. So yeah, you kind of have this, you know, this sort of a cut corner type of thing. Each of these images are little harps, which seems to be done very, very nicely. This is a really solid, sort of thick cardboard type of jacket. The image wraps all around, so it's very, very nice. Let's see. So the first thing that I'm pulling out here before we get to each of the albums, I need to put this somewhere, is a booklet. And I hesitate to call this just a booklet. It's almost a book. This is, there's a lot of pages here. I don't know if there is page numbers. Yeah, so it's about a 39-page booklet. So this is pretty substantial. Another nice image of Ashby on the cover. And yeah, there's a foreword. So there's a foreword by Brandee Younger, which I'm really excited to read. I'm also getting a whiff of the smell of like freshly printed paper, and it's very lovely. I've said this before in other videos. I used to collect baseball cards. A lot of people who collect vinyl used to collect something else. And anyway, you'd open the pack and you'd have those like, you know, Fleer and what were some of the other ones? I don't know, like Fleer Ultra and like, I don't know, different baseball cards like Leaf and stuff like that smelled, had this like kind of like freshly printed smell. That's what this reminds me of. Anyway, a lot of text, a lot of images, reproductions of each of the covers that are listed in here. So for example, you can see, you know, there's her self-titled right there. It looks like it has album reviews as well from different publications, which is kind of cool. So I'll be interested to go through all of this, even correspondence that she had, photos, like photocopies of, I don't know if these are receipts or like, you know, probably records of how she was paid perhaps, for different sessions. I don't know. I kind of like all that stuff, and they seem to do a really solid job here with this. Yeah. And it's, and it looks like at the very end, there's a bunch of, you know, almost like essays or interviews with other musicians, other harpists, probably talking about Ashby and her influence. I say probably because, again, haven't read it yet, but I will. All right, so moving into each of the albums, and I knew this going in, and so I am going to, I was at least prepared to talk about this. So I'm trying to think for each of these, not all of them were originally laminated, the original pressings, they were not all originally laminated. However, I do know that with the reissue, they decided not to laminate any of them, and they went for this actually quite high quality, sort of even like tactile, sort of nice paper, and even textured. There's like there's almost like a sort of a faint texture to it, and I think it's a really nice way to present the albums. I mean, it looks very nice. It's definitely thicker cardboard. It's not anything flimsy here. Each of them are kept in. This is something that Newland does. They have the black, but you know, the PVC lined inner sleeves. And the other thing that I know that they are doing with all of their releases, not just this box set, is that they're not making an attempt to replicate the labels. So they're not going with the strategy of, say, I hesitate to say tone poet, because they're not even really doing exactly how they might have been in terms of deep groove, but they're not doing what like Contemporary is doing in terms of trying to replicate, or Kraft is doing with the Contemporary series. Instead, Newland has their own label for each of these, and you know, for me, it doesn't really matter to me. These don't have to be you know, precise carbon copies of different albums. But in any event, you know, very, very nice presentation here for sure. Let me just take a look at maybe a couple of others, and I'm sure we'll get to each of them eventually. So this is Hip Harp, and this is actually quite interesting because the cover doesn't even look like what I would expect the cover to look like. And the reason why is because the original covers all look like garbage. They all have these like mottled kind of look, because I think there was some problem with, I don't know if it was the printing or applying the lamination back then, but it is just impossible to find a copy specifically of Hip Harp, well, generally, but then also one without damage, significant damage in terms of the tones on the cover. So it's very interesting to see it so clean in this format. But yeah, very, very nice. And I'll say this, like Kraft is doing actually with their contemporary series, they're coming up with a new catalog number that they actually apply to these jackets, as opposed to going with the original one. And so what you can see here is Newland X003-2. So they seem to have taken a cue perhaps from some of these other companies. And in fact, you know, let's be real, this is licensed by Kraft. At least some of these, because Kraft, I think when Kraft owns the catalog, and they do for Prestige because it's under the Concord umbrella, these are Kraft recordings, obviously, right? It's just that that Newland is the one who is actually going through the process of actually reissuing them and putting in all the effort to remaster them and all those different types of things. But the content is licensed by Kraft, at least for some of these. I'll have to double check. So anyway, these are looking really, really nice. No issues with I haven't heard of anybody having issues with their shipments of these things. The packaging was very nice, but again, you can see, I mean, this just looks fabulous, I think. Yeah, really, really, really nice. So yeah, that's In a Minor Groove. Here is Soft Winds, which is the lone Jazzland title, right there. Here is her self-titled for, again, I want to say Argo, and I'm about to verify whether it's Argo or Cadet. She actually has titles that are on both, and so sometimes I forget which one was on what label, but I believe this one is Argo. Again, another really fantastic cover image. And the last one that we have here is the fantastic Jazz Harp of Dorothy Ashby, and this was put out originally on Atlantic. Man, the colors really pop on this one. This one actually might be my favorite in terms of the how they did the cover. So very, very nice. And yeah, so I know that the question is, how'd they do? I mean, obviously the packaging is great, but how did they do in terms of replicating the music? And so let's talk a little bit about that. In the meantime, I'm going to actually listen to some of these. All right, so you probably know that I could do a 25-minute video on each of the titles in this box set, but I'm not going to do that. I am going to try to keep it brief, at least for each individual title. So what I want to talk about right now is it's just a little bit of a sort of sonic comparison, I guess, across each of these. And there may be some consistencies we'll see, in which case I can just sum up and kind of tell you what my thoughts are, but I'm actually doing this sequentially. I've only listened to this first album, and I'm now talking about it. So the first one that I want to talk about is the Jazz Harpist. And so what I have is obviously the Newland, and I have the original Regent album. And you'll see, sorry, I'm not going to do like cover comparisons. You'll see that there's a little bit more sort of contrast here versus this one. But again, this one's laminated and this one isn't. So they're kind of different. But what I will say across these two copies, and remember that this is one of two. This album is one of two where they lost the original master tapes. And so, yes, it's the lacquers were cut by Kevin Gray, but it's not sourced from the original analog tapes. And what I would say with this title is that you can't really tell. You can't really tell a difference between these two. Now, that's not entirely fair, because there is a little bit of a difference. It's just that it's not that overt. So what I would say with the Regent title, based a little bit on its age, is that there's a little bit of a noise floor, and that also some of the music comes across as a little bit muddy, and some of the instruments aren't I don't know, I don't want to say they get lost, because they don't, but they're just not distinct, I would suppose, all the time. There's a little bit of just kind of muddiness to some of the sound, and it keeps it from just sounding as crisp as it could. And I actually feel like with the Newland title that it isn't as muddy, and you certainly don't have the noise floor, and so you are able to pick out those instruments. And here's the thing, maybe you can pick them out simply because there's no noise floor, right? That, you know, when there's any type of noise floor, then you kind of lose out on some of the nuance. And with this remastering, it's very quiet, and so it sounds great. So I personally am very happy with this. Now, this is a title where my Regent copy happens to be in pretty decent shape. So you could say, do I really need the reissue? Well, you know, I mean, let's be real. These titles are only coming in the box set. They're not being released individually. And for many of us, or for many of you out there, finding an original copy is going to be quite difficult. And so I think that this is certainly does the music justice, despite the fact that this is not one of those all analog pressings. It really does sound good. All right, second up is Hip Harp, and you'll see what I was talking about when I was talking about the modeling of the cover. This is not soiling and dirt and water damage. This is just what happened to the cover. And again, I haven't come across a copy of this that doesn't have at least some version of this kind of issue with the cover image. Some are not as bad as this. This one is pretty bad, but anyway, like I said, that's why it was kind of interesting to be able to see it probably closer to how it was supposed to look, and so clean. Anyway, again, we're not comparing covers. So in terms of the music, so where I said the prior album, the Regent title, didn't have as much of a difference, but subtle improvements, this one sounds really good. This one sounds fantastic. So, you know, I don't know if we can necessarily credit the fact that it's all analog, although that's a very easy thing to do. But the Newland title sounds really, really good. It is definitely more detailed. Now, let's be real. My original copy is not in the best shape. I would call it like VG to VG plus, maybe a little bit closer to VG plus, but it still has this kind of noise floor that detracts a little bit. But more than that, the Newland title is super dynamic. It's almost like it was like sort of hot, you know, like the mix was like hot or whatever. Like it really accentuates the drums, and it seems really bright, and it seems much more detailed. And what I realized when I was listening to this was that the stops of like the harp and the bass were much more precise, where I could hear the sustain of the music, and I could hear exactly when they dampened the string in order to stop the music, because there are a few sort of stops where they do that, especially in the opening track. And you do not get that detail. Even after hearing that, I went back to the original and tried to hear where those stops were in the original, and I couldn't. And so there is certainly more detail on here. It is cut louder. Setting your dial on your amplifier or whatever to a consistent setting will reveal that this one was mastered a little bit louder. Some people prefer it when mastering is quieter, and then you have to turn it up. But anyway, in this case, what I'm telling you is that the Newland one is quite a bit better than this original. And guess what? These originals are impossible to find. I only found this probably like 2 months or 3 months before they announced the box set. So here I am with an original copy, which is great. But if I'm going to listen to it and enjoy it, it's going to be this reissue, I think. All right, so the next one up is In a Minor Groove. This is the new jazz title. You can see the original compared to the reissue. There is a slight difference in terms of the cover here. This one was actually enlarged just a little bit compared to this one. And so there's a little bit sort of less of the image. They've kind of zoomed in a little bit on it. And then you can see, obviously, so therefore the text has gotten a little bit bigger. And with each of these, you know, they're removing the old catalog number, because again, they have their own new catalog number that they're not putting on the cover, they're putting on the back. But anyway, yeah, so you can kind of see them here. So very similar reaction with this one as I had on Hip Harp, the prestige title that we just talked about. And that is that, well, so first of all, admittedly, my copy is probably a VG copy, but this one also has a little bit of a noise floor. Now, some of that could be through a little bit of light crackle, but it does feel like there's still a little bit of a noise floor regardless. And with this one, it is very quiet. I say that, but there's so much space on this one that is actually filled with brushes that it's almost hard to tell whether it would have a noise floor or not, because there's so much brushwork. But what I would say about this title is that it is the reissue is more dynamic, and it is more detailed, and especially I think with Frank West on this one, more of that detail is manifested in Frank West's flute. and so you hear more of his breaths, and you hear more of sometimes the air that's passing through the flute without it producing a sound, the same way that you get with, say, a saxophone or even a trumpet, something like that, where you get a little bit of like ancillary air that's coming through the horn or the instrument. You get some of that here, and that does add a little bit of kind of nice detail. And so I think this one sounds better balanced than the original. And again, I think this in hip harp so far, what I would say is that this in hip harp it's the sort of presentation of music that would please those of us who are used to what, say, Blue Note is doing with Tone Poet, or what Craft is doing with it's technically Craft and Acoustic Sounds, right, that are kind of collaborating, I think, isn't that right, on the Contemporary series? But anyway, that kind of treatment, right, where they're not fundamentally, see, that's the thing, is that on Tone Poet, you could say that in some cases it does feel quite a bit different in presentation than the original. This doesn't feel different in presentation, but it does feel like that they're achieving balance, and at the same time they're bringing out a lot of detail in some of the specific instruments. And so there is a pretty decent, pretty big difference listening to these two and listening to hip harp. Whereas if you're tracking so far, the first one that we covered, Jazz Harpist, on the Regent label, was a little bit less of a difference, but sounded just as good, if not better. All right, next up is Soft Winds, the swinging harp of Dorothy Ashby. This is on the Jazzland, which again is a subsidiary of Riverside label. It's kind of interesting, right? Because like Regent was tied to Savoy, and New Jazz was tied to Prestige, and Jazzland was tied to Riverside, and she seems to play on some of these sort of subsidiary or types of labels. So, real quick, these are pretty similar, maybe slight, very slight color intonation difference or whatever, but just really fantastic image anyway, this sort of stylized, almost like stretched image of each of the musicians playing. I actually really like it. So this album probably has the biggest difference yet between the two pressings. And I guess how I would describe it is that the original has some issues. And it's a little bit unusual because this one was recorded at Plaza Sound, and Plaza Sound actually was a better studio as far as I can tell than Reeves was, which is another one of the other sort of major studios that they recorded at. And I'm trying to think of the other one off the top of my head. There was like three studios. To me, it always seemed like the more dynamic, the more interesting recordings almost were recorded at Plaza. Now, don't get me wrong, there's some classic stuff recorded at Reeves. It's just the better sounding stuff, by and large, seemed to me to be recorded at Plaza. Maybe that's just me. But anyway, what you have in this one is quite a bit of echo, actually. So there's a heavy sense of almost reverberation in the room, and then even with individual instruments where like the vibraphone rings a little bit too much. I know there's like dampening pedals or something on vibraphones, right, that I think that they could dampen it. But it feels like it rings too much. And I would also say that there's some pretty abrasive sounds that aren't that pleasing associated with the harp. And it's not detail. It seems to me to be like, I don't know if it's like unintentional sort of noise associated with her playing, but whatever it is, it's not the sort of thing I would have noticed if this was the only version I heard. But because I have heard this version, it's very apparent that those things aren't there. So you don't have the same echo, you don't have the same reverberation of the vibraphones, at least quite as much, and you also don't have some of that noise associated with like the harder strumming, I think, of the harp. Now, what I don't want to suggest is that there's less detail in this one, because if anything, I think there's more discernible detail here. Whereas in the original one, it gets a little bit washed out because of the echo, and because it's just not necessarily like pleasant sound. It feels like there's more separation between the strums and between the hits of the vibraphone, and so it feels like there's better detail here. There is some detail here, but it's not all good. But the detail sounds better to me here, and so, like I said up front, I think that this is the biggest difference out of the titles I've discussed so far. The biggest sonic difference is between these two, and I do think that the New Land title has quite a bit of improvement. All right, the next one up is Dorothy Ashby's self-titled, and this one is on Argo, right? So I know that this one is This one is probably one of the most maybe contentious or problematic reviews to do because this is one of her best loved albums. Her work for Cadet and Argo, I think rightly so, is kind of recognized as maybe the reason why there's been a little bit of resurgence in Dorothy Ashby's work. All of her work is great, but I think that the music that's on this title is a little bit more just palatable to sort of the modern audience in terms of how it sounds and the style. And so anyway, that's why. And just, yeah, like a lot of people really love this album. And this album has been sought after for a really long time. And so the fact that this is a reissue, it's possible that there are folks out there that this title is one of the primary reasons why they might decide to purchase this box set. So that's why it's potentially problematic in terms of anything I might say about it. So first of all, I think just from a cover standpoint, right, this is probably one of the most direct, sort of reproductions out of these titles. Obviously, this one is not laminated. It's like a little bit of like a glossy paper type of thing, whereas this is matte. But otherwise, these are pretty much the same. So from a sonic standpoint, one of the things that I noticed about this original is that the harp is very, very bright, and it is quite a bit louder than the rest of the instruments. Even like, again, this sense of like a mix being hot, like the harp is definitely hot in this mix. It sounds louder, sounds brighter. And then sort of counterbalancing that is a very heavy bass. So it's a little boomy. And don't get me wrong, it sounds good. It definitely sounds of the period, I would say. But those are the most notable things I think in this is that the harp is just it really hits you in the face in kind of an exciting way. So there is some excitement out of this mix, even if even if the bass is a little boomy, and even if perhaps it's not quite as balanced as it could be. So that's the original, and so you probably know where I'm going with this title based on some of what I just said. So there is better balance here. And how that's manifested is that Dorothy Ashby is not quite as loud in the mix. The bass is not as boomy, and it is more detailed. There's also quite a bit more detail around the drums. And I think as the music starts, I think especially on the track Lonely Melody, there's a hit probably on the side of the snare. At least that's what it sounds like to me, is it's like the drummer is hitting, I say the drummer, who's the drummer on this thing? It's John Tooley. Hitting the side of the snare, kind of keeping time, and there's actually quite a bit of nice sort of detail. It's like this pop that happens every now and then, and it sounds really, really nice. So I think what you get with the reissue, and by the way, this is the other title that is not mastered from the original analog tapes, along with the first one, Jazz Harpist. I think what you get here is a little bit less of that in-your-face kind of, it's the sort of thing that a lot of people really, really like out of mono recordings, where it almost just hits you like a wall. You get a little bit less of that with the reissue. What you gain is better balance across the musicians, and you get less of a boomy bass and more detail. And so I could see, especially for purists, if you're listening to this, you might say that, oh, well, original sounds better to me or on my setup. But I think that there is enough here to still please anyone, certainly who can't afford the hundreds of dollars it would cost to get an original. But even so, it is a great sort of reproduction of the original music, and it does sound good, and it does sound, like I said, balanced. I think that's the story with this one. All right, and finally, we have the fantastic jazz harp of Dorothy Ashby. So this is the Atlantic title. Here's the original. Here's this one. So what we don't have is the Atlantic logo, and then we also don't have the full spectrum mono and the catalog number. Again, they're kind of like removing the catalog number in some ways, like slightly sort of sanitizing the previous label that might have put it out, because they're kind of rebranding it right as this as the Newland sort of edition. And that's just kind of what it is. And incidentally, I know I said earlier that some of these were were licensed by Kraft because Concord owns the rights, but that's not true for all of them. And in fact, this one says this one actually says Omerta Inc. under license courtesy of the Dorothy Ashby estate. So some of this stuff was obviously licensed stuff from different places. But anyway, this is the final one. This one was from the original master tapes, like again 4 of the 6 were, and This is it's an interesting one to finish up on because in some ways, um, this is always the title that surprises me the most because I think that I always forget about this one, that it was put out on Atlantic, and out of these 6 titles, this one was the last one to be put out, which was put out in 1965. So what I would say about this is a couple of things. First of all, even the original recording sounds great. It's a very nice recording. Dorothy Ashby sounds great. There's auxiliary percussion on here, so it's not just a drummer. You have, who is it? Because you have Grady Tate on drums and you have Willie Bobo on sort of auxiliary percussion. And it sounds really nice. Little bit a product of the time, sort of that mid-60s incorporation of Latin instruments type of thing that gives it a little bit more of a pop vibe, I would say. There's also 10 tracks here, so they're not quite as long as on some of the prior albums. In fact, there's a number of these tracks that clock in at 3 minutes or under. So it is short. It probably was considered a little bit more of a pop-oriented album, whereas I would say, especially that Argo title was probably not as much and felt like a little bit more of Dorothy Ashby as the sort of auteur kind of composer artist. And not quite as much here. And in fact, even the choice of the content, I mean, there are 3 original Dorothy Ashby tunes, but that's out of 10, right? So you have a bunch of other stuff that's maybe, perhaps a little bit more familiar. So the other interesting thing you have on this is you have a couple of different formats. You have a quartet format, but then you also have an octet format, because on some of the tracks, I want to say it's 3 or 4 of them, they added 4 trombones. And that 4 trombone sound really is at like sort of almost like a block chorus. You can't necessarily discern individual trombones. It really is like a block of trombones that provide relatively soft accents. And it's a little strange. It feels a little bit too poppy, a little bit more like TV soundtrack-y. And again, I think that's because, like I said, that this seemed to be a little bit more of a pop-oriented album. And they're going for that sound perhaps a little bit. But here's the thing. That's not unique to either the original or Newland's reissue. That's just the recording, right? So let's talk about the recording. And really, here's the thing. Original sounds really nice. There's no complaints about the original. It sounds pretty balanced. Dorothy Ashby sounds really good. Pop-oriented or not, she sounds really, really good. Just a lot of clarity of tone, independent of the format, whether you're talking about the quartet or the octet. When it comes to those trombones, especially on the track, it's the closer of side 1 called What Am I Here For? It's a Duke Ellington tune. When you hear the trombones, they're just so like soft. Like so like just almost barely there, and almost a little bit of an annoyance, like you're hearing them in the other room or something and they just happen to be playing at the same time that Dorothy Ashby is. I could do without them. I'd rather it just be the quartet format. With the reissue, there just really isn't that big of a difference whether you're talking about the quartet format or you're talking about the octet. The trombones sound the same in the octet songs, and in the quartet songs, it is the same. Like you still hear Dorothy Ashby still has the same sort of clarity of tone and the same strength of it as well. And so there isn't as much of a difference. If I was to pinpoint anything that's a little bit different between these two, I would say that that Willie Bobo's probably congas. Trying to think if he if he's playing congas there or if it's something else. But there's a little they feel like they're brought out a little bit more, or they're just a little bit more apparent. There's a little bit more detail to them. And so you always want to be able to hear every instrument who's playing, and I think that they're captured very well here. But out of all of these may be the most similar. And maybe it's difficult to extract that much more from the master tapes when you consider that this is the most modern of the recordings. I mentioned that the self-titled one sounded relatively modern in terms of how it sounded, and this one does as well, again with the exception of that very sort of strange quartet of trombones that is added to some of these tracks. So that is the 6 albums. All right, so just a couple of closing comments about this thing. I'm quite impressed with this box set by Newland. So as I mentioned, it is a limited edition. They are not going to be releasing the individual albums within it, at least, by Newland in this format. Who knows what another outfit may do. But I think that this is a great opportunity to collect so many albums across so many different labels, because how long would we have to wait for each of those, really the 6 labels? I mean, okay, I understand New Jazz is part of Prestige, and I understand Jazzland is part of Riverside, but out of those 6 different labels, how long would we have to wait for whoever owns the rights to those different albums to decide to put them out? And so I think it's very exciting that Newland decided to do this and to bring them all together. Gives you a really good sense of, again, this sort of origin of improvisational harp, and overall I think they did a really, really good job. I mean, each of these albums sound really just as great as you might expect them to. Again, there are 2 that were not sourced by the original master tapes. We can't always tell the difference. That first title, A Jazz Harpist, I still thought that the reissue sounded better, and there was maybe a little bit more sort of nuance or argument for the original when it came to her self-titled for Argo, but I still think that the reissue sounds really, really good, and even is a little bit better in certain ways, right? Whereas the original is maybe better in other ways. So the whole presentation of this thing seems really solid. I can't wait to pour through that booklet, because I love learning about music, and I'm sure that there's lots of great stuff in there. So this is a strong recommend from me. And incidentally, each of these comparisons I did with mono. So all of these albums in the Newland box set are mono presentation. Is that right? I'm gonna double check with you, but I'm almost positive that even on this one, I think these are all mono, right? And they released all of these originally all mono, but I do believe that each of these are mono, and certainly, I mean, part of it is because my original is a promo copy, but even this 1965 original, this one is mono. So know that it was mono to mono comparison across each of these discs, and those are kind of my thoughts. I mean, it may beg the question: you have each of these in their original format. Why did you buy this box set? Well, I like buying things, but more to the seriously. The reason why is because some of the titles that I care the most about are the Prestige and the New Jazz titles, and my copies aren't in great shape. Also, I just like the idea of some of these comparisons and hearing the best version, and I think that there's a lot of this music really is the best version that you can get, because it does sound better than the original. It covers for a lot of flaws, and it offers more detail, and it's a more engaging listen. So will I get rid of the originals? Probably not, because that's not really what I do, at least in every case. I have been selling off some of the duplicates from even shootouts that I've done in the past on YouTube. But in this case, I'm probably going to keep them just because I want to. And we'll see what gets more listening time. But, I think it's quite obvious, I think, probably from my comments, that I'm very excited about this box set. Very excited to really fully listen to each of these albums, because even just for this discussion today, I wasn't able to take the time to listen to all of the albums in order to provide my thoughts. But I think that my thoughts are at least representative of, probably the entire albums, or at least what I've heard of the albums. So I suppose that's it. I will see you next time.